Greetings and salutations to you from Tony Denton here in the Phoenix, Arizona area on June 6th, 2017. It's 107 degrees so far today. It's going to get a little bit hotter, so I'm staying inside in the air conditioning. Let's talk about eschatological time statements a little bit. The word eschatology comes from the Greek word that means end or end times. So it has to do with end time statements that are found in the Bible. The significance of God's time statements are established very well in the book of Ezekiel, which was written about 597 BC. In chapter 7, verses 1 through 12, God very clearly told Israel that the time of his judgment against her by means of Babylon had come upon them in that it was soon and near. Around 586 BC is when that statement was made. Then, in chapter 11, 1 through 4 of Ezekiel, we read of some men, including one guy named Benaiah, who contradicted God's nearness prophecy. So, after God spoke against him, verse 13 has God taking the life of Benaiah's son. Then in chapter 12, 21 through 28, God condemned Israel for contradicting his time statements or for allowing his time statements to be contradicted. For when he said judgment was at hand, soon and near, Israel denied it. And God just could not tolerate that any longer. Romans chapter 15:4 tells us that we can learn from the Old Covenant. So we should learn from Ezekiel chapter 7, 11, and 12 how God feels about how others feel concerning his time statements. Now, the significance of that was true also for Jesus. In Matthew 24, after the disciples asked Jesus for signs of the end of the age, he prefaced his list of various events that had to occur before the end by warning them that false signs and Christs would appear to them to cause them to believe that the end was nearer than it actually was. Just check out Luke chapter 21, verses 8 and 9. After that, he went on to list two major events that would inform them that the time was actually at hand. Number one, the gospel would be taken into the world, Matthew 24:14. And number two, the abomination of desolation would occur, verse 15 of Matthew 24, when the Roman armies were headed for Jerusalem. Luke 21, 20, and 21. I'm mentioning Luke 21 and Matthew 24 both because those are synoptic gospel accounts of Jesus' Olivet Discourse. You can find that discourse of his in both places. So we'll probably jump from time to time from Matthew 24 to Luke 21, even Mark 13, and maybe Luke chapter 17. Anyway, based on those two events, the gospel being taken into all the world, and the abomination of desolation occurring, Jesus said that then they would know that the end was near, even at the very doors, Matthew 24, verse 33. Incidentally, those people of 2 Timothy chapter 2, 17 and 18, that's the passage where Paul mentioned Hymenaeus and Philetus. And there's also people referred to in 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 3. Those people Paul was referring to perfectly fulfill Jesus' predictions. The people under consideration in those two passages were teaching some of the very things Jesus had prophesied would come about. People would say certain things to lead others to believe that Christ has already come or appeared. If you check those out, it's pretty interesting how well they fit into the category and the picture of what we're talking about here. In fact, in 2 Thessalonians 2, Paul went on to describe for them, the Thessalonians, some things which must occur as well as those people come along saying what they said. 2 Timothy chapter 2 is included because although it was AD 65 or so, they still said it was earlier than Jesus said it would be. So although the opposites are found with God in Ezekiel versus Jesus in Matthew, namely, deceivers saying things were further off than God indicated in Ezekiel, and deceivers saying that things were closer than Jesus indicated in Matthew 24, The point is demonstrated that God and Jesus feel strongly about our heeding their time statements as well as any other information that aids in pinpointing their fulfillments. Because we've generally taken all this seriously, we use such passages as Matthew 3 and verse 2, Matthew 4 verse 17, and Matthew 10 verse 7 against premillennial people, at least those of us who were raised amillennial. We use Matthew 3, Matthew 4, Matthew 10 against premillennialists in order to show that the kingdom was right around the corner or within the grasp or generation of the time of Jesus. Not to mention that this timing means it was spiritual in nature. That's what we do with those passages, Matthew 3, 2, Matthew 4, 17, Matthew 10, 7, to show that the kingdom was around the corner right at that time, and it was therefore spiritual in nature. Okay? That's very important to remember those two things, especially if you are an amillennialist or have been and are just kind of checking out things now. Think about how that's going to work out. Time statements concerning Christ's second coming are as follows. I'm going to mention a few of them. Although 2 Thessalonians, written around AD 49, has Paul comforting those brethren by telling them the time for Christ's coming was not going to occur immediately, many years later, around AD 61, when he wrote Colossians and Philippians, he mentioned that the gospel had been taken into the world, Colossians 1:23, and that, quote, the Lord is at hand, unquote, Philippians 4, verse 5. Then, about a year later, James wrote that the coming of the Lord is at hand, chapter 5, verse 8, so much so that he was pictured as standing at the door, chapter 5, verse 9. About 2 years after that, Paul wrote, yet a very little while indeed, the coming one will come and will not delay, Hebrews 10, verse 37. And that's from the Diaglot, an interlinear of the Greek language. And you can also check out Young's and various other versions that show that that passage is much stronger in its language than what the King James seems to indicate. In other words, it's saying something like, yet in a very, very little while, the coming one will come. Anyway, about 2 years after that, Peter said that Jesus is ready to judge the living and the dead, and that the end of all things is at hand, and that the time has come for the judgment to begin. That's 1 Peter 4, verses 5, 7, and 17. Ready to judge, the end is at hand, and a time has come for the judgment. And one more, before I move into the book of Revelation for a little bit. Around the same time as 1 Peter, John wrote in 1 John 2, verse 18, as well as in 2, verse 28, little children, it is the last hour. Around the mid-80s to late 80s. And that was written not long after the book of Revelation, wherein John penned at least 10 statements referring to the fulfillment of Revelation almost immediately. Notice, quite a few verses here. Chapter 1, verse 1. I'm going to read from a few different versions for these verses, and I'll mention what they are. But if you go on my webpage and find the notes for this audio, you'll find quite a few other passages listed for each of these verses I'm going to share with you. Right now, I'm just going to mention the ones that you'll find underlined in those notes. Chapter 1, verse 1, the New Living Translation says he refers to events that will happen soon. Chapter 1, verse 3, the Contemporary English Version says the time is almost here. Chapter 3, verse 11, in the NIV, I am coming soon. Chapter 6, verse 11, in New Contemporary Version, I think that is, it says, just wait a short time longer. Chapter 10, verse 6, the NCV again, there will be no more waiting. Chapter 11, verse 18, the CEV, Contemporary English Version, the time has come. Chapter 12, verse 12, the NCV again, New Contemporary Version, I think that is. I forgot which one that is exactly. I have to look it up, but you can find it online. Says he does not have much time left, referring to the enemy. Chapter 14, verse 7, the NCV again, the time has come for God to judge, just like 1 Peter 4:17. Chapter 22, verse 6, the CEV. What must happen right away? He says this is what must happen right away. Chapter 22, verse 7, the New Living Translation, the NIV, ESV, and so on. I am coming soon. Chapter 22, verse 10, the CEV says these things will happen soon. 22, verse 12, the NLT and NIV and others. I am coming soon. Chapter 22, verse 20. I am coming soon. CEV, NIV, and so on. So quite a few of them there, and you can look these up in all sorts of other versions to see how much emphasis is placed upon the imminency of what is about to take place. Now, concerning chapter 22, verse 10 of Revelation, I want you to think about this for a moment. That verse says that these things will happen soon. Or some versions say the time is at hand or the time is near. But if you go back to Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, it says the time is not near, not at hand. It's a ways off. Now, Daniel is the background for Revelation. Yes, there are other Old Testament books like Ezekiel and Isaiah that are referred to from time to time, but Daniel is the primary book behind the book of Revelation. And John, who wrote Revelation, remember now, John was the only one of the gospel accounts who did not present the Olivet Discourse. And I'm convinced personally the reason he did not give his version of the Olivet Discourse is because he was going to do Revelation. Revelation is, in a sense, the fulfillment, the expanded version of the Olivet Discourse. Just think about that. But anyway, back to contrasting now, Revelation 22:10 with Daniel 12 and verse 4. Between Daniel 12 and Revelation 22, there's 500 years of time, at least. Yet, we have 2,000 years since Revelation to us today. So think about that for a moment. Whereas he tells Daniel to close it all up because the time is not yet, 500 years before Revelation. In Revelation, he said the time has come, and yet 2,000 years later, people are still saying it has not come. Something's a little wrong with that picture. Also, something else that's interesting, there are 4 or 5 times in the book of Revelation where, if you look at the King James, for example, it says, I come quickly. The original language, the original Greek language, with a more proper translation for us today, is saying, I am coming quickly. Not I come quickly, but I am coming quickly, or I am, as some versions say, coming soon. It's present tense. I come quickly is present tense, yes. But for us today, in translating that into our language, I am coming quickly, or I am coming soon, is the more accurate translation. If we want to say that the word quickly there means how fast he's going to come, like the twinkling of an eye, when it does come time for him to come, then Jesus would have said, I will come quickly. In other words, when I come, I'll do it quickly. But he didn't have it in future tense. He has it in present tense. I am coming quickly, not I will come quickly. Now, if the clause, these things must shortly take place, in some of the verses we read in Revelation, means that these things must shortly begin to take place, as some people affirm, then why all the various imminent statements throughout the entire book of Revelation? As chapters 2 and 3 indicate, weren't those to whom this was read suffering Christians who were meant to take comfort in Jesus' statement at least 4 times that he was coming soon? They were to find comfort in it. Chapter 1, verse 3. He was meaning for them to get comfort from the idea that he was coming soon. But if they were not even going to be in existence for 2,000 years before Jesus came, what was the point? How would the reader have been blessed, first chapter, verse 3, if the time was thousands of years away? They would already be dead or martyred. Besides all those imminency statements in the book of Revelation, one can see the horrible Jewish persecution of the 60s was referred to in chapter 2, 9 and 10, and chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. Secondly, the tribes of Israel weren't destroyed yet, according to Revelation 6:16 and 17. Compare that with Luke 23:28 through 30. And also compare Revelation 16:15 with Matthew 24:43 through 46. Number 3, the temple was still standing, Revelation chapter 11, 1 and 2. This wasn't the church because it was in the city that would be future trampled by Gentiles, verse 2. The city in which Jesus was crucified, verse 8. In other words, Revelation isn't about papal Rome. It was about the destruction of Jerusalem with its temple, because the Gentiles had not trampled it down yet, chapter 11. And number 4, the 6th Roman king, Nero, was still alive and reigning at the time Revelation was written, chapter 17, verse 10. Julius was number 1. Augustus was number 2, Tiberius was number 3, Caligula was number 4, Claudius was number 5, and Nero was number 6, and after him came Galba, who was only in office for 6 months? Maybe less. Nero was in power, between AD 54 and 68, meaning Revelation must be placed within that time frame, somewhere between AD 54 and 68, even before the book of 1 Peter was written, because Peter, I am convinced, is written to some of the very same people as Revelation. In Revelation, they were not yet suffering, while Peter in 1 Peter 4:12 says they were already involved in the suffering. Just check out the churches Peter wrote to in comparison to the churches mentioned in the book of Revelation. So the point is that not only did the apostles know when the end was not near, but they also knew when it actually was near. That's what we've discovered in the last 10 or so minutes of all these verses that I've referred to, not just in Revelation, but the ones that I referred to before we got to Revelation. Well, here are a few more passages to consider. In 1 Timothy 6, verse 14, Paul told Timothy to keep the commandments without stain or reproach until you die. Is that what he said? No, I misquoted it. That's not what it said. Paul told Timothy, keep the commandments without stain or reproach until the appearing of our Lord. Now, if Paul did not believe the Lord's coming was that soon, that much at hand in Timothy's day and time, then why did he tell Timothy to be sure to keep the commandments until he died? Wouldn't there be a much bigger chance of his dying than the Lord coming? Why did he make it sound as though he believed young Timothy would still be around when the Lord came? Compare that with Jesus' exhortation in Revelation 2:25, where he said, hold fast until death. Nope, that's not what he said. Hold fast till he come. Same thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 7 and 8. In Titus 2, verse 13, Paul told Titus to be looking for the appearing of the Savior Jesus Christ. Now, does that sound as if Paul believed young Titus would be dead before the Lord came? Not at all. It sounds like Paul believed and was convinced that Titus would still be around when the Lord came if he didn't get martyred. But the point is, he would be able to be alive. He was young enough to see the coming of the Lord. Hebrews 10:25, we find that same concept. James chapter 5, verse 7, same concept. So I'm not reading all these verses. You can go read those and see how well they fit into what I'm talking about right here in reference to 1 Timothy 6:14 and Titus 2:13. Speaking of the time subsequent to the judgment, Revelation 14:13 says, blessed are those who die in the Lord from now on. What? Yeah. Okay, here's a problem I had to grapple with. In fact, I got another problem after this one I had to grapple with when I was an amillennialist and decided that that wasn't the biblical eschatology. If the apostles condemned people within the first 25 to 30 years after Jesus' resurrection for making folks think that Christ's coming in judgment was right around the corner when it was actually 10 to 15 years later, then wouldn't the apostles be condemning themselves for speaking in the early 60s about how near it was if it really wasn't near for 2,000 plus years? Let me say that one again, okay? Gotta catch this. If the apostles condemned people within the first 25 to 30 years after Jesus' resurrection for making folks think that Christ's coming in judgment was right around the very next corner when it was actually 10 or 15 years later, then wouldn't the apostles be condemning themselves for speaking in the early 60s about how near it was if it really wasn't near for 2,000 plus years? See, if Jesus wasn't talking to his first century apostles about their age group, then wouldn't they, in effect, have been the very deceivers Jesus warned about in his Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and Luke 21? Doesn't it seem that Jesus in Luke 21, 8 and 9 was condemning those who would claim the end had come or was near or was at hand when it really wasn't? If, as I've heard, the disciples didn't have any more or any better information about when the time of Jesus' coming really was around the corner, then this all the more makes me wonder why they weren't also to be rejected when they in the 60s were saying what others were saying in the 30s and 40s. Did you catch that one? Okay, let me say that one again too. If, as I've heard, the disciples did not have any more or any better information about when the time of Christ's coming really was, then this all the more makes me wonder why they weren't also to be rejected when they in the 60s were saying what others were saying in the 20s and 30s, or 30s and 40s. And along the lines of how all this seems to make the apostles appear deceitful, if they, and Jesus for that matter, knew that Christ's coming wasn't going to be for 2,000 plus years, then why warn people to be ready for his coming instead of just being ready for their deaths? For however we die is how we're going to be judged, right? Was it because that most of that generation would indeed still be around when he came? Sure makes sense to me. Alright, another problem to grapple with concerning a particular Greek word, mello. M-E-L-L-O. Let me share with you what a couple of scholars say this word means. W. Vine says the term mello means, quote, to be about to do something, the certainty of what is about to take place, unquote. And J. H. Thayer says it means, quote, to be about to do anything on the point or verge of, unquote. And here are some places where this term is found and how those verses are translated in Young's literal translation. Young's is more literal based on the Greek than the King James or New King James or NIV or whatever. Okay, listen to these few verses. Matthew 16:27. Here's how he translates the word mello in these places. The Son of Man is about to come in the glory of his Father with his messengers, and then he will reward each according to his work. Verily I say to you, there are certain ones standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his reign, or his kingdom. Okay, now think about that one. Verse 27 says, Matthew 16:27, the Son of Man is about to come. Verse 28 coincides perfectly when Jesus said, some of you standing here shall not taste death till you see my coming, or my coming in my kingdom. The kingdom was spiritual, invisible, Luke 17. Jesus' coming was also, therefore, spiritual and invisible. Think about that one for a little bit. Acts 17:31. Here's Young's translation. He has set a day in which he is about to judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he did ordain, having given assurance to all, having raised him from the dead. Acts 24:15. Having hope toward God, which they themselves also wait for, that there is about to be a rising from the dead. Acts 24:25. Paul reasoning concerning righteousness and the judgment that is about to be. Felix, having become afraid, answered, for the present be going, and having got time, I will call for you. 2 Timothy 4 verse 1. I fully testify then by the Lord Jesus Christ, who is about to judge the living and the dead at his manifestation and his reign, or kingdom. Hebrews 1 verse 14. Are they not all spirits of service for ministration? being sent forth because of those about to inherit salvation. The angels were sent for those who are about to inherit salvation. In other words, even though Paul is writing to Hebrews who have been Christians, some perhaps for 30 years, he said they were about to inherit their salvation. Lastly, 1 Peter 5 verse 1, according to Young's Literal, elders who are among you I exhort, who am a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of the Christ and the glory about to be revealed. Okay, here are a few other time passages to consider. We're about finished now. As we read these first three, it helps to remember that Matthew wrote his gospel account to Jews using, quote-unquote, the word many of their prophecies in order to prove that Jesus was their long-awaited Messiah King, as well as what Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians verses 20 and 21, where he said, do not lightly esteem prophecies, but prove all things and hold fast that which is right. Okay, so let's look at Matthew 5, 17 and 18. Jesus said to his Jewish audience, don't think that I came to destroy the law of Moses or the teaching of the prophets. I have not come to destroy them, but to bring about what they said. I tell you the truth, nothing will disappear from the law until heaven and earth are gone. Not even the smallest letter or the smallest part of a letter will be lost until everything has happened. Did Jesus do what he said he came to do? I believe he did. And if we're going to take heaven and earth literally there, then we must still be under the old covenant law. Reread that a few times and see what I'm talking about. Matthew 13:40. Jesus said to his disciples that his return in judgment would be at the end of this age. Greek word tutu. T-O-U, end of this age. And we all agree Jesus was born in, lived in, and died in the Old Covenant age. Now compare that idea with Galatians 4:4 and Hebrews 9:26. Born in it, lived in it, and died in it. He said the judgment in Matthew 13:40 would be at the end of this age. Also in Matthew 13, verse 43, Jesus echoed Daniel 12, verse 3, which of course should bring to mind its context of, well, the entire short chapter of Daniel 12, wherein he refers to the resurrection in verse 2, at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in verse 7. In Matthew 10, 22 and 23, Jesus said to his disciples, you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end, not till he dies, he who endures to the end will be saved. But when they persecute you in this city, flee to another, for assuredly I say to you, you will have not gone through all the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Ouch. That's a hard one to swallow, isn't it? Moving on, Matthew 16, 27, 28, we already read it, but one more time. The Son of Man will or is about to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works. Assuredly, or in fact, I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Matthew 26:64, Jesus stated, soon you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. That's a contemporary English version, which must not be too far off in translation, since Thayer says the Greek word arti, A-R-T-I, means properly marking the time closely connected to the present. So Jesus said, soon you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Now Luke 22:69, a slightly different term is found, which carries with it the idea that based on what's occurring right now, from this point on, at the point from Jesus' perspective, it says the Son of Man will, that is soon in the NLT version, sit on the right hand of the power of God. In other words, from the time of his death, resurrection, and ascension until he returned, all which would occur soon, Jesus would be putting down his enemies. Confer that with Psalm 110 verse 1. Also significant is that Jesus used the plural form of you in Matthew 26:64, indicating that he was referring to the lifetime of the Sanhedrin members in general, regardless if Caiaphas himself was still alive in AD 70 when Jesus returned in his kingdom. That's what Matthew 16:27-28 is about. Compare that with Matthew 25, 30, 31, and so on. One more passage, and then we're finished, okay? Or almost finished. Another interesting passage is John 21, and it strongly indicates that Jesus would return between the time of Peter's death and John's death. After Jesus told Peter about his future martyrdom, Peter asked him, "Well, what about him?" Speaking about John. To which Jesus said in verse 22, "If I want him to remain till I come, what's that to you?" In other words, Jesus didn't think it humanly impossible for John to still be around when he returned. And since the disciples began a rumor that John would be alive when Jesus came, then they must have expected Jesus to come back in John's lifetime as well. Otherwise, that passage makes no sense. Again, let's don't forget how it seems very inconsistent to use Matthew 3:2, Matthew 4:17, and Matthew 10:7 against the premills if you're a non-millennial person, only to reject the same and even stronger language when it comes to Jesus' coming passages. Passages that even link his coming with the coming of his kingdom. 2 Timothy 4 verse 1 speaks about him who is about to judge, and 1 Thessalonians 5:23 speaks about the preservation of their bodies blameless until his coming. Go check that verse out, 1 Thessalonians 5:23, and explain what he meant there about preserving their body, or their bodies, until his coming. All of these biblical time statements are important due to the logical rule of interpreting the more obscure, that is, the nature of Jesus' coming, with the more clear, that is, the time declarations. The time statements are clear, which means we have to start rethinking the nature and the purpose of Jesus' return. Obviously, if all these verses that we've referred to actually mean what they clearly appear to mean, then we must reevaluate our previous beliefs about the nature and purpose of the Lord's return. Also consider Jude verse 14 and its context and ask yourself, was Jude mistaken? Anyway, there's more verses out there we could go to and talk about with reference to time statements concerning the eschatology or the end times of the Bible, biblical end times, not man's made up ideas of end times. But these should be more than enough to get you started on your journey of determining what the Bible actually teaches about the end times. Thank you for your time. Check out the notes for this on my website as well as a lot of other notes and audios.